It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The sun outside was warm, but inside the bank, the air felt still and heavy. Matt stood in line, waiting for his turn. He had been there for about 10 minutes, glancing at the clock on the wall and tapping his foot slowly. The line was long, and people around him were looking down at their phones or staring at the floor. In front of him stood an older woman. She wore a black coat that looked a little too big for her. Her gray hair was tied back in a simple way, and she held a small white envelope in her hands. Matt noticed how tightly she gripped it, as if she was afraid it might disappear. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around the room. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't even look up. Something about her caught Matt's attention. Maybe it was the way she stood so still, or maybe it was the quiet sadness on her face. She looked like someone who had been through a lot. The line moved forward slowly. Matt took a step, still watching the woman. He wasn't trying to stare, but he couldn't help noticing how alone she looked. The room around them was full of little noises, people sighing, fingers tapping on screens, the distant hum of a printer. A child in the corner played with his mother's keys, dropping them with a loud clang every few seconds. No one seemed to notice the woman. Finally, it was her turn. She stepped up to the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she handed the envelope to the young teller behind the glass. Matt couldn't hear everything she said, but he caught a few words: my husband, pension, and passed away. The teller's expression changed. He frowned and looked down at the papers. Then he shook his head and asked for something. The woman replied softly, her voice barely reaching Matt's ears. She seemed unsure, like she didn't understand what was wrong. The teller sighed and leaned forward. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said. Without the right documents, I can't process this. The woman looked down at the counter, her face turning red. She clutched the envelope tighter. Someone behind Matt muttered something impatiently, and the line shifted as people grew tired of waiting. Matt felt a strange feeling rise in his chest, something between anger and concern. He looked at the woman again. She wasn't trying to cause trouble. She wasn't being rude. She was just lost. He didn't know her name or her story. But in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. She needed someone to stand beside her. The woman's voice was barely a whisper, but Matt heard it clearly. I'm just trying to cash my husband's pension check. He served in the military. I thought I had all the right papers. She spoke with a kind of quiet desperation, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on the counter. The young teller behind the glass looked at the papers in front of him, scanning them quickly before shaking his head. I'm really sorry, ma'am, he said, his tone polite but firm. But I'm going to need more than this to process the check. The woman's face turned pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked down at the counter again, her fingers pressing into the envelope so tightly that Matt could see her knuckles turning white. There was a long, awkward pause as the teller continued to sort through the papers. I don't understand, the woman said, her voice shaking a little. I was told this was everything I needed. Matt could see the frustration starting to build. The line behind them was growing, and people were shifting from foot to foot, waiting impatiently. A couple of people mumbled under their breath, clearly annoyed at the delay. One man sighed loudly, his face showing the irritation that came from being stuck in line for too long. The teller looked back up at the woman. I'm sorry, but I can't do anything without the proper documents. I'll need you to come back with what I need. Matt saw the woman's eyes begin to well up, though she tried to blink the tears away quickly. Her lips trembled, and she took a small step back, clearly not sure what to do next. She had the look of someone who was completely out of their depth, someone who had already gone through more than enough in life and just couldn't face another obstacle. Matt took a deep breath. The tension in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. He glanced at the people around him. Most were just watching the scene unfold with growing impatience, but no one seemed ready to step in. Maybe they didn't want to get involved, or maybe they simply didn't notice how much the woman needed help. He couldn't stand it any longer. The woman needed someone to help her, someone to stand up for her. It wasn't fair that she had to struggle alone like this, especially after everything she had been through. Excuse me, Matt said, his voice steady but loud enough to be heard by the teller. The young man turned his head toward him, his eyebrows furrowing slightly. Is there a reason why this woman is being treated like this? She's just trying to get her husband's pension. Why can't you help her? The teller looked taken aback, clearly not used to being questioned so directly. He opened his mouth to respond, but Matt didn't wait for him to finish. He turned to the woman and gave her a reassuring look. "Don't worry, I'm going to help you with this," he said gently. The woman looked up at him, surprised but clearly grateful for his sudden support. Matt could see the relief in her eyes, even if she was still unsure of what was going to happen next. He wasn't sure how this would play out, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. Matt took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him now. The air seemed heavier as the tension stretched between him, the teller, and the woman standing at the counter. It was one of those moments when doing nothing would feel worse than stepping in. Matt wasn't sure how things would turn out, but he couldn't just stand there and watch. He turned to the woman again. "Can you tell me exactly what papers you have? Maybe I can help." The woman hesitated for a moment, looking down at the envelope in her hands. She looked exhausted, as if she had been carrying a weight far too heavy for far too long. With a shaky hand, she slowly opened the envelope and pulled out a few pieces of paper. They were creased and worn, as if they had been handled too many times. Matt could tell they weren't in perfect order. "This is all I have," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the bank. "I thought everything was in order." Matt took the papers from her gently, looking at them with a more focused eye than the teller had. The woman's handwriting on the forms was neat, but there was something about the documents that seemed incomplete. He could tell that the paperwork was part of a long process, probably more confusing and frustrating than anything she had ever expected to go through. "It's okay," Matt said softly, trying to reassure her. He glanced at the teller, who still seemed unsure of what to do. "Maybe you can take a look at these again. Check them for something that might have been missed." The teller looked at him, then back at the papers, before giving a small nod. He didn't want to admit it, but Matt could see that the young man was a little out of his depth. He was just following the rules, not really understanding the situation. It wasn't his fault, but Matt could tell that there had to be a better way to handle this. "Okay," the teller said after a long pause. "I'll take a closer look, but it might take a little while." Matt smiled slightly and nodded. "Take all the time you need. No one should rush you." As the teller went to the back office with the papers, Matt turned to the woman again. She looked at him with a mix of gratitude and worry. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't know what to do. I thought I might never get it fixed." Matt shook his head. "It's no problem at all. Sometimes things don't go the way we expect, but it'll get sorted." The woman nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing a little. She glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at Matt. "You're kind to help. Most people just ignore you in places like this." Matt didn't know how to respond to that. He didn't feel like he was doing anything special. It wasn't about kindness. It was about fairness, about doing the right thing. But he didn't want to make her feel like he was doing something heroic. He simply did what anyone should have done. They stood there in silence for a few moments, waiting for the teller to return. Matt could hear the faint rustling of papers in the back, the quiet buzz of the air conditioning. The room felt less tense now, but the woman still seemed nervous, unsure of what would happen next. Just then, the door to the back office opened. The teller returned with a fresh stack of papers, looking a little more confident. He walked up to the counter, handed the papers to the woman and said, "We found everything you need. It's all set now." A small smile appeared on the woman's face. Her relief was clear as she took the papers in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered again, this time with more confidence. Matt simply nodded. "You're welcome." The bank felt quieter now. People were finishing up their business and starting to leave, the earlier tension forgotten. Matt stayed where he was, watching the woman as she left the counter. She looked back at him, her eyes full of gratitude. As she walked out the door, Matt couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. He hadn't done anything extraordinary, but he had made a difference. Sometimes standing up for someone was all it took. Matt stood quietly by the counter, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. The woman had left, and he hoped she felt a little better. Sometimes, helping someone out of a tough spot was all it took to make the day feel right. He hadn't expected anything in return. Just doing the right thing was enough for him. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, the door to the bank opened again. Matt barely noticed it first. His attention was on the teller, who was busy organizing the papers from the earlier transaction. But then something in the air shifted. It was subtle, but Matt felt it. A man walked into the bank, tall and confident, with a military posture that immediately caught Matt's attention. The man was dressed in a full uniform. He had medals on his chest, and the way he walked made it clear he was someone important. People in the bank paused and looked up, sensing the change in the atmosphere. The general's eyes scanned the room, and for a brief moment, Matt wondered if he was there for some official business. The general's gaze landed on the counter, and to Matt's surprise, he made a beeline straight toward the woman who had just finished her transaction. Matt watched as the general approached the woman with a gentle but firm step. "Mrs. Harper," he asked in a calm voice. The woman, who had just been trying to leave, turned in surprise. Her face was still tired, but when she saw the general, her eyes seemed to brighten. "Yes," she answered, her voice unsure, almost as if she wasn't sure who this man was or why he was speaking to her. The general smiled warmly and nodded. "I'm General Williams. I served with your husband overseas. I came as soon as I heard." Matt couldn't help but listen closely. The woman's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry. Her hands trembled, but she stood tall, trying to keep her composure. You knew him?" she asked softly. "You knew my James?" The general nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I did. And I wanted to personally thank you for your husband's service. He was a brave man, and I've been keeping in touch with the department to make sure you're taken care of." Matt could see the emotional relief on the woman's face. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had been struggling alone with the paperwork, but here was someone who had known her husband, someone who understood her situation. The general didn't stop there. He turned to Matt, who was still standing nearby, observing. "And thank you," the general said. "I heard what you did to help her. I'm grateful for that. We need more people like you in this world." Matt blinked, surprised by the compliment. He hadn't expected anything like that. He simply nodded, feeling a little embarrassed. It was strange to be recognized for something he thought was just a simple act of kindness. The general turned back to the woman. "We've already made sure everything is in order. I'll be sure to follow up personally. You don't need to worry anymore." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but these were tears of relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." The general gave a small smile, then turned to Matt once more. "Thank you again, sir. You did something important today. Don't forget that." As the general walked out with the woman, Matt stood there for a moment, feeling a strange mix of humility and pride. He hadn't done it for the praise, but hearing the general's words made him realize that sometimes a small act of kindness could go much further than anyone expected. The door to the bank swung closed, and everything returned to normal. People resumed their business, the quiet murmur of conversations filling the room. But for Matt, the moment felt like it had changed everything. Sometimes the right thing to do could have a ripple effect, one that reached farther than he could ever know. As the general and Mrs. Harper left the bank, Matt stood for a moment, still processing everything that had just happened. It was a strange mix of emotions, relief for the woman, pride in his small act of help, and a curiosity about what would happen next. He never expected that helping her would lead to such an unexpected turn of events. As the door closed behind the general and the woman, the teller, who had been so unsure of how to handle the situation, looked over at Matt, still standing by the counter. "You know," the teller said, his voice quieter now, "I didn't think she'd get that kind of help today. I guess sometimes we forget how much something small can change things." Matt shrugged, not sure how to respond. "It wasn't much," he said simply, glancing toward the door. "Just felt like the right thing to do." The teller nodded, looking down at the counter and shifting papers around nervously. There was an awkward silence between them for a moment. Matt couldn't help but wonder if the teller had ever had to stand up for someone before. He seemed like a good person, but perhaps he had never seen how much of a difference something small could make. Then, just as Matt was about to turn and leave, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around to see the general walking back into the bank. Matt raised an eyebrow, confused, but the general was already walking toward him with a confident yet friendly stride. The man's presence filled the room, and people who had been too busy to notice before now turned their attention toward him. "Hello again, sir," the general said, offering a hand. "I wanted to personally thank you for what you did earlier." Matt was taken by surprise. He had expected the general to leave after helping Mrs. Harper, but here he was, back to speak with him. Matt shook the general's hand, unsure of what to say. "It was nothing," he replied. "Really, just helping out. Anyone would have done the same." The general chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not everyone would. You stood up for her when no one else did. That's something I don't take lightly." Matt felt a bit of warmth in the general's words, though he wasn't sure why. It wasn't like he had done anything extraordinary. He simply couldn't stand by while someone else struggled. It was the right thing to do, that's all. "I wanted to let you know," the general continued, "that we have a network for people who need assistance, especially when it comes to veterans and their families. If you ever need anything or want to help out more, you can reach out to me. You've got the heart for it." Matt blinked, surprised. He had never expected to be invited into something like that. Helping out was something he did instinctively, not because he wanted recognition. But now, here was the general, offering him a chance to get involved in a much bigger way. "Thank you," Matt said, unsure of what else to say. "I really appreciate it." The general nodded. "Just remember, small acts can make a big difference. You might never know just how far your kindness can reach." With that, the general turned and walked back out of the bank, leaving Matt standing there, a little unsure of what had just happened. The general's words echoed in his mind as he walked to the door, a thought lingering in the back of his mind. Maybe, just maybe, he had done more than he realized. Matt left the bank with his mind still buzzing. He had helped a woman who seemed to have been carrying a burden far heavier than anyone should have to bear. Then the general had come in, a surprising twist that changed the whole experience. Matt had walked in that morning with no real intention of anything extraordinary happening, but by the time he stepped outside, everything felt different. As he walked down the sidewalk, the ordinary sounds of the city filled his ears. The distant honking of cars, the murmur of people talking, the sound of footsteps echoing on the pavement. But none of it seemed to reach him in the same way. It was as if something had shifted, and the world felt a little more connected, a little more meaningful. He thought about the general's words. Small acts can make a big difference. Those words stuck with him. They didn't just apply to the situation in the bank. They could apply to anyone, anywhere, and at any time. Matt wasn't sure if he had always believed in the power of small acts, but now he couldn't deny it. Sometimes one moment of kindness could change the direction of someone's day, maybe even their life. As Matt turned the corner and walked past a coffee shop, he paused for a moment. The thought of joining a veterans network kept echoing in his head. Could he really be a part of something like that? He wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but the idea of making a bigger impact lingered in his mind. He wasn't the kind of person to sit back and watch. He had always been the kind of person to step in when something didn't feel right. Maybe this was just another way for him to do that. He decided to stop for a coffee and take a few minutes to think. The small cafe was cozy, with warm yellow lights and the scent of freshly ground coffee beans filling the air. He stood in line, tapping his fingers against the counter as he waited for his turn. As he did, he couldn't help but notice the people around him. A young couple talking quietly, a man reading a book in the corner, and an elderly woman chatting with the barista. Each person seemed to be wrapped up in their own world, unaware of the quiet ripple effect that small actions could have on their lives. When it was his turn, he ordered a simple coffee and stepped aside to wait. As he stood there, his thoughts wandered back to Mrs. Harper and the relief on her face when she had received the help she needed. He thought of how, in that moment, a stranger's kindness had turned her frustration into something more hopeful. As he took his coffee and found a seat by the window, he couldn't help but wonder how many other people, like Mrs. Harper, were out there, feeling lost or overlooked. He realized that there was so much he could do, even if it was just lending a hand when someone needed it most. Matt sipped his coffee slowly, thinking about how the small act of stepping in had led to something bigger. He might not have changed the world, but maybe, just maybe, he had changed someone's day. And that was enough. The next few days passed quietly for Matt. Life returned to its usual rhythm, with work, errands, and the small moments that filled up his time. Yet, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there, like a quiet hum that followed him through his day. The idea of small acts making a difference lingered in the back of his mind, and he found himself looking for opportunities to help, even in the simplest ways. One morning, as he sat at his kitchen table sipping his coffee, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it, thinking it was just another spam call. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the general's words that stuck with him, or maybe it was just the desire to do something meaningful. He picked up the phone. "Hello. Hi, is this Matthew Thompson?" The voice on the other end was polite, clear, and formal. "Yes, this is Matt," he replied, wondering who it could be. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Kelly from the Veterans Support Network," the voice said. "I was given your name by General Williams. He mentioned that you might be interested in getting involved with us." Matt sat up straighter, surprised. He had almost forgotten about the conversation he had with the general a few days ago. "Oh yes, I remember. I didn't expect to hear from anyone so soon." The lieutenant colonel chuckled. "Well, we like to reach out quickly when people show interest. We're always looking for volunteers who want to make a difference, especially when it comes to supporting military families." Matt's heart started to race a little. He had thought about the offer, but now that it was real, it felt a bit overwhelming. He wasn't sure where to start or what exactly he could do. "I'm not sure what's involved," Matt said, his voice uncertain. "I mean, I don't have any special training or experience." "That's perfectly fine," the lieutenant colonel reassured him. "We have a range of opportunities. You could start by helping with paperwork, assisting at events, or even just providing support for families in need. The important thing is that you care and are willing to help." Matt thought for a moment. He could picture himself helping in some way, maybe even doing something small, like he had done for Mrs. Harper. It didn't have to be anything grand, just enough to make a difference. "I'd like to learn more," he said, feeling a sense of purpose begin to form. "Great," the lieutenant colonel replied warmly. "We have an orientation session next week. I can add you to the list if you're interested." Matt hesitated for only a second. "Yes, please. I'd like that." "Wonderful," the voice on the other end said. "We'll send you the details soon. Thank you for being willing to help. We really appreciate it." As the call ended, Matt sat back in his chair, a small smile creeping across his face. He had no idea what would come from this, but he felt a sense of excitement. It was a new chapter, one where he could be a part of something bigger than himself. He looked out the window, the morning sunlight streaming in. Maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand what the general had meant. It didn't take much to make a difference, and sometimes the smallest step could lead to something much bigger than expected. The day of the orientation arrived sooner than Matt had expected. It was a bright Saturday morning, and Matt found himself standing outside a large building with the Veterans Support Network's logo on the front. He hadn't been sure what to expect when he signed up, but now that he was here, there was a mix of excitement and nervousness in the pit of his stomach. As he walked through the door, he was greeted by a warm smile from the receptionist, a woman who handed him a name tag and directed him to a conference room. "We're glad to have you with us," she said kindly. Matt smiled back, still unsure of what to expect. The conference room was filled with a dozen or so people, all sitting in chairs, chatting quietly among themselves. They looked like a mix of ages, backgrounds, and experiences. Some of them looked like they had been volunteering for a while others, like Matt, were new to the whole thing. He took a seat near the back, trying not to draw attention to himself. Soon, the lieutenant colonel from the phone call entered the room and stood at the front, ready to begin the session. "Welcome, everyone," he said, his voice commanding but friendly. "I'm glad to see so many new faces here today. The work we do can be life-changing, not just for the families we support, but for you as well." Matt sat up straighter, listening closely. The lieutenant colonel continued, explaining the various ways volunteers could help, from assisting at events to offering emotional support to veterans and their families. He spoke about the importance of kindness, patience, and commitment. "We're not just providing a service," he said. "We're showing these families that they're not alone. That's what really makes a difference." As the session went on, Matt began to feel a growing sense of connection to the group. Everyone seemed so genuine, and there was an energy in the room that made him feel like he was part of something important. He learned about the different ways he could get involved, helping with veterans' paperwork, organizing community events, and even just offering a friendly face when someone needed it most. Toward the end of the session, the lieutenant colonel opened the floor for questions. Matt raised his hand, his voice a little uncertain. "How do you know when you've made a difference?" he asked. It was something he had been thinking about ever since he helped Mrs. Harper at the bank. The lieutenant colonel smiled at him warmly. "That's a good question," he said. "The truth is, you may never know the full impact of your actions. Sometimes the difference is small, a conversation, a kind gesture, but it matters. You may never hear someone say thank you, but that doesn't mean it didn't make a difference in their life." Matt nodded slowly, taking in the words. He realized that helping wasn't always about big gestures or grand recognition. Sometimes it was just about showing up when someone needed it, even in the smallest way. After the session ended, Matt felt more at ease. He had learned a lot, and he was eager to get involved. As he left the building, he felt a new sense of purpose. It wasn't just about making a difference in one person's life anymore. It was about becoming part of something much bigger, where small acts of kindness could ripple out and change lives, one step at a time. As he walked to this car, the sun was setting behind him, and for the first time in a long while, Matt felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. This was just the beginning.